Hey guys, tonight we are pulling back the avocado green curtain on one of the most chemically sedated decades in American history. We're talking about the 1970s, the era of shag carpeting, fondue sets, and the little yellow pill that kept suburban housewives feeling absolutely nothing about all of it. Tonight's topic is the deadly, the absurd, and the genuinely haunting life of the Valium-Addicted Housewife in 1970s Suburbia. And before you get too comfortable, which honestly is the theme of tonight, take a quick second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here. First, a genuinely warm thank you to the viewer who suggested this one. You know who you are, and I want you to know that I read every single comment. Your suggestions are what shape this channel, and the fact that you trust me with topics this layered and this human means everything. It really does help this little corner of the internet grow one insomniac at a time. And speaking of insomniacs, we're now on Spotify. If you'd rather listen while you stare at the ceiling at 2 a.m, the link is in the description. Now, dim those lights, turn on a fan, pull that blanket up to your chin, find your most aggressively comfortable position and stay there. Because before we begin, I want you to really sit with some questions. Have you ever wondered what it felt like to wake up in a house that looked perfect on the outside and felt like a very tasteful coffin on the inside? Have you ever thought about what it's like to have a doctor hand you a prescription for your feelings, not because something was medically wrong with you, but because your feelings were inconvenient to the people around you? What does it feel like to drive the kids to school, defrost a casserole, smile at the neighbour's husband, fold the laundry, and do all of it with the quiet, cottony numbness of a woman who has been chemically encouraged not to ask too many questions? Was the fog a comfort? Was it a trap? Could you even tell the difference after a while? And what did it cost? Not in dollars, in everything else. Congratulations, you've just woken up in 1973. You're wearing a house coat that matches the kitchen wallpaper. There is a casserole dish soaking in the sink, a Virginia Slim burning in the ashtray on the counter, and somewhere in the medicine cabinet behind the Aquanet and the children's aspirin, there is a small orange bottle with your name on it. The doctor gave it to you 6 months ago for what he called nerves. You haven't asked what that means. You've stopped asking a lot of things. Good luck. Let's start at the beginning, or rather the exterior of the beginning, because in 1970s Suburbia, the exterior was everything. The house is a 3-bedroom ranch style on a cul-de-sac so quiet, you can hear the automatic sprinklers click on at 6 a.m. like a tiny obedient alarm. The lawn is green, the shutters are painted, the station wagon in the driveway is recently waxed. From the street, everything about this life announces that someone inside is doing an excellent job. What it does not announce is that the someone inside has not felt a genuine emotion since sometime in 1971. And she's largely fine with that. The house was built in 1964, which makes it the same age as a lot of the marriages on the street, and they share certain qualities: good bones, no insulation to speak of, and a tendency to develop small structural problems that everyone agrees not to discuss. The kitchen is avocado green. The living room carpet is harvest gold. The wallpaper in the dining room features a repeating pattern of roosters, because someone in 1967 made that decision, and everyone since has simply adapted. The house is clean because you clean it. The house is organised because you organise it. The house is everything a house is supposed to be in 1973, which means it functions primarily as a stage set for a life that is performing contentment with great technical skill. Your neighbours have the same house, slightly modified. Linda across the street has colonial shutters. The Hendersons 2 doors down have a flagpole. Everyone has a garage, and in every garage there is a lawnmower, a bag of rock salt for winter, some paint cans, and at least one unfinished project that has been unfinished for 3 years and has now simply become part of the architecture of the marriage. You know which couples are struggling not because anyone says anything, but because you can hear, from across the cul-de-sac on a summer evening, the specific frequency of a raised voice through a closed window. Nobody says anything. This is the social contract of the suburb. Inside your house there is a logic to everything. The spice rack is alphabetical. The children's school papers are filed in a drawer in the kitchen. There is a calendar on the refrigerator with every appointment, every school event, every dentist visit written in your handwriting, which is neat in the way that things become neat when neatness is the primary channel available for a particular kind of intelligence. You're organised the way a person is organised when they have a lot of energy and nowhere specific to put it. Channeled, precise, efficient, applied entirely to a context that could be managed perfectly by someone of half your capability. This is not something you have said out loud. You're not sure you have thought it in quite those words. The pill helps with that, with the edges of thoughts that feel like they might go somewhere inconvenient if you followed them all the way to the end. The house is your job. You do it the way your mother did it and the way her mother did it before that, except your grandmother had 12 children and real poverty to manage, and you have 3 children and a dishwasher, and the distance between those two situations should theoretically produce a surplus of something: time, energy, satisfaction, meaning. But it has instead produced the particular hollow busyness of a person doing work that was designed for harder circumstances, applied to easier ones. From the street, the house looks perfect. From the street, everything looks perfect. And the street is, after all, where everyone is looking. You didn't find Valium. Valium found you, handed over a desk with a prescription pad, and a brief conversation your doctor had clearly had hundreds of times before. It is the early 1970s, and Valium-Diazepam made by Roche Pharmaceuticals is the most prescribed drug in America. Not in your neighbourhood, in America. Between 1968 and 1981, it holds the record as the single most prescribed medication in the Western world, and your doctor is treating your vague unhappiness the way a mechanic treats a rattling engine, with something that stops the noise. He calls it anxiety. He calls it nerves. He does not ask what you are anxious about, and you are too polite to volunteer the answer. His office smells like antiseptic and old carpet. There are magazines in the waiting room, Good Housekeeping, Reader's Digest, one ancient National Geographic that nobody has touched since 1968. You waited 22 minutes past your appointment time, which is normal, because your doctor is a busy man who sees 40 patients a day and allots each of them approximately 8 minutes of his total attention. You got 9. You felt lucky. You told him you were having trouble sleeping. You told him you felt wound up most of the time, tense, like something was vibrating just beneath your sternum that you couldn't turn off. You mentioned crying in the car last Tuesday for no reason you could name. You said this quickly and looked at the floor when you said it, the way you'd been trained to report bad news, briefly and with apology. He nodded. He wrote. The conversation had the shape of a diagnosis, but the texture of a formality. The way a customs officer asks if you have anything to declare, and everyone involved understands that the question is not really a question. He told you it was anxiety. He told you this was very common, especially in women your age, especially women managing a household, especially in this season, as if anxiety had a season the way allergies did, as if your nervous system was simply responding to something in the air. He told you the medication was mild, safe, very well tolerated. He did not tell you it was a benzodiazepine. He did not tell you that your brain would, within weeks, begin restructuring its own chemistry around its presence. He did not tell you about dependence, because in the medical literature of 1972, dependence was considered a problem of weak-willed people and addictive personalities, a category that emphatically did not include women like you. He handed you the prescription. You thanked him. He was already moving toward the door. This is not a story about a monstrous doctor. That would be easier. This is a story about a doctor who was a product of his training, his era, and a pharmaceutical industry that had done an excellent and well-funded job of convincing the medical establishment that female unhappiness was a neurological disorder with a simple and profitable solution. He was not the villain. He was the mechanism. The distinction is important, and also, from where you're standing, does not change very much about how the next 10 years of your life unfold. You filled the prescription on the way home. You picked up the kids from school. You made dinner. You took the first pill at 8:30 that night and woke up the next morning feeling, for the first time in recent memory, like the volume on everything had been turned down to a manageable level. You thought, this is what fine feels like. You'd forgotten it felt like this. You were grateful. You were exactly where they needed you to be. By the time the Rolling Stones released Mother's Little Helper in 1966, it wasn't a warning, it was practically a documentary. The little yellow pill was already woven so deeply into the fabric of suburban domestic life that it had a nickname, a cultural shorthand, a knowing wink between women who absolutely did not talk about it out loud. You didn't discuss your prescription at book club. You didn't mention it to your mother-in-law, but you noticed, quietly, that Diane from next door had the same slightly smoothed-out look around the eyes, the same particular calm when her kids were screaming in the backyard, the same way of pausing just a half-second too long before answering a question. The song was not sympathetic in any straightforward way. Jagger sang it with something between mockery and pity, the voice of someone watching from the outside of a life and finding the whole arrangement faintly absurd. The woman in the song is running to her shelter, the little yellow pill, to help her on her way, to get her through her busy dying day. It's a song about sedation as survival, about a life so structurally exhausting and emotionally unsustainable that chemical management is the only logical response to it, and the song never once questions the life itself. Only the woman's method of enduring it. That, in a few chords, is the entire cultural framework of Valium in the 1970s. By the middle of that decade, estimates suggest that somewhere between 1 in 5 and 1 in 4 American women were taking a prescribed tranquilizer at some point in any given year. Not 1 in 20, not a small clinical population with diagnosable anxiety disorders. 1 in 4 women. This was not medicine treating illness. This was chemistry managing a demographic. And everyone involved, the doctors, the pharmaceutical company, the husbands, the women themselves, had tacitly agreed to call it treatment because treatment had much better paperwork than the alternative, which was acknowledging that a significant portion of the female population of the most prosperous nation on earth was chemically miserable, and nobody was planning to do anything structural about the reason. The nickname itself tells you everything. Mother's Little Helper, not patient's medication, not therapeutic treatment. Mother's Little Helper, the language of domesticity applied to pharmacology. The pill positioned not as medicine but as a household tool, as useful and unremarkable as the good scissors or the cast iron pan. It helps. It helps mother. It helps her do the things that need doing, which are the things she has always done, which will continue to be the things she does. And isn't it lucky that there's something that helps? You heard the song on the radio one afternoon while you were folding laundry and you laughed. A short, single laugh. The kind that contains things you haven't quite decided to think about yet. You turned the radio up. You finished the laundry. The pill was in the medicine cabinet. The kids would be home in 40 minutes. The Stones were right, is the thing. They were absolutely right, and everyone knew it. And the song was played approximately 8,000 times on American radio stations, and nothing changed because a pop song, it turns out, is not a sufficient mechanism for dismantling an entire socio-economic structure. But it named the thing. It named the thing at a moment when naming things was beginning to feel dangerous and possible in equal measure. Your morning has a rhythm to it, the same way a factory floor has a rhythm, efficient, repetitive, and not particularly designed with your personal fulfillment in mind. The alarm goes off at 6:45. You put on the housecoat. You start the percolator. You wake the children. You make the lunches, 1 peanut butter, 1 bologna, both with the crusts cut off, both with a little wax paper packet of Fritos, because it is 1973, and the concept of nutritional guidelines is not yet interfering with anyone's mornings. And somewhere between the percolator and the lunch boxes, you open the medicine cabinet, shake 1 small pill into your palm, and swallow it with tap water. Not because you are falling apart, you're very specifically not falling apart. That is in fact the whole point. The morning routine is a machine you built and now operate. Breakfast is eggs on weekdays, scrambled because that's faster, and pancakes on Saturdays because Saturdays are supposed to feel different, and the pancakes are the mechanism by which the weekend announces itself in this house. You have made thousands of breakfasts. You have made this exact breakfast so many times that you can do it while holding a conversation, while locating a lost shoe, while filling out a permission slip on the counter with one hand and flipping eggs with the other. You are extraordinarily competent. Nobody has told you this lately, but it is objectively true. Your husband eats quickly and leaves. He takes his coffee in a travel mug. He says goodbye to the kids and sometimes, if it occurs to him, to you. You have stopped tracking whether it occurs to him. The pill helps with the tracking. The children leave at 7:40. The school bus stops at the corner and they run for it with their lunchboxes, coats half-buttoned, and for a moment you stand in the doorway and watch them go and something in you rises toward them. Something warm and real that the pill can't quite flatten. And then they round the corner and the feeling settles back down and you are alone in the house. The house that needs cleaning. The house that always needs cleaning, that will need cleaning again the moment you have finished cleaning it. That is somehow both your primary accomplishment and the least satisfying thing you do. You pour a second cup of coffee. You sit at the kitchen table. The house is quiet in a way that would, without the pill, feel like pressure. That specific suburban silence that has no ambient sound behind it, except the refrigerator hum and your own thoughts, which are not always good company. With the pill, the silence is simply silence, neutral, manageable. You can sit in it without it sitting on you. This is the morning. This is every morning. The variations are minor. Sometimes there is a dentist appointment. Sometimes someone forgot their homework. Sometimes your husband needs a shirt ironed and mentions this at 6:58 in a tone that implies the ironing is already late. But the structure is fixed. The routine is the container, and the pill is what makes the container bearable, not joyful, not meaningful, not in any way connected to what you thought a life at 34 would feel like. Just bearable, smooth, manageable. You wash the breakfast dishes. You're good at that too. Here is a thing about your husband. He is not a villain. This is somehow the most complicated part of the whole story. He goes to work, he comes home, he eats dinner, he reads the paper, he watches the news, he occasionally asks about the kids' grades. He's not cruel, he's not dramatic, he's simply profoundly, structurally absent from the actual texture of your interior life, and he has no idea that this is a problem because no one has told him it is, and the pill is doing an admirable job of making sure you don't bring it up. He notices the house is clean. He notices dinner is ready. He does not notice the small orange bottle in the medicine cabinet because he has never once opened the medicine cabinet. And why would he? It's your medicine cabinet. He married you in 1961. You were 22. He was 25 and working at the firm and had a kind face and his mother liked you, which at the time seemed like an important qualification. The wedding was in June. There are photographs on the bookshelf of both of you looking genuinely happy, in a way that is not performed, and when you look at them, which you do less often now, you believe they were genuine. You were happy. He was happy. The happiness just had very little structural support beneath it, no framework for becoming something more durable than the feeling itself. And so when the feeling shifted, as feelings do, there was nothing holding the architecture up. He's not unkind. He just doesn't know you very well. He knew you in 1961 and assumed that version of you was a fixed and stable thing, and you accommodated that assumption for so long that sometimes you're not sure it isn't true. The woman he married wanted to teach school or possibly go to graduate school for literature. She'd read everything, had opinions about all of it, talked fast when she was excited and used her hands. He remembers this woman with some fondness. He does not notice that she has been very quiet for several years. He would be horrified, genuinely horrified, if he understood what was happening. This is possibly the most disorienting part of living inside a marriage that has failed through inattention rather than malice. There is no one to be angry at because the neglect was never intentional, never pointed, never designed to diminish you. It was just the natural result of a man who came home from work tired and assumed you were fine because you presented fine, and because fine was what the whole arrangement required. The pill helps you present fine. It smooths the seams. It keeps the presentation consistent enough that the gap between performance and reality doesn't become visible in the moments before dinner, when you're most likely to say something honest and most likely to regret it. He pours himself a scotch most evenings. He sits in his chair. He watches the news. Walter Cronkite tells him what has happened in the world today, and he processes this information with the steady, measured concern of a man who has outsourced the running of his personal life so completely and so successfully that he has enormous amounts of cognitive space available for geopolitical events. You watch him from the kitchen doorway sometimes. You feel, through the medium of the pill, something that is not quite love and not quite anger and not quite grief. Something that has no clean name in the English language. Something that would probably require a full sentence at minimum to describe. You go back to the kitchen. You finish the dishes. You love your children. That is not in question, not even chemically muted that love is still there, solid as a stone at the bottom of a river. But there are afternoons, long, beige, seemingly endless afternoons, where you watch them play in the backyard from behind the kitchen window, and you feel as though you're watching them through very clean, very thick glass. Their laughter arrives delayed. Their needs feel like they're coming from a slight distance. You respond to them, you feed them and bathe them and read to them. You just can't quite feel the edges of anything anymore. A paediatrician would later call this emotional blunting. In 1973, it is called being a good mother because you're not screaming. Your oldest is 11. She is sharp and observant in the way of children who have learned to read the emotional weather of a household for information about how to behave, which is a skill that only develops when the household's emotional weather is unreliable or difficult to decode. She watches you carefully. She has learned to gauge your mood not by what you say, but by the speed and quality of your movements. Quick and purposeful means fine. Slow and slightly unfocused means something else she doesn't have a word for yet. She's not frightened, exactly. She's calibrated. She's learning to be calibrated before she is old enough to know what calibration costs. Your middle one is 8 and needs you differently, physically, constantly, with the uncomplicated ferocity of a child who has not yet learned to edit their need for contact. He climbs on you. He leans against you while you read to him in the evenings, his head on your shoulder, one hand absently gripping your arm. These are the moments when the glass thins, when the love comes through at full strength and you think, here is the real thing, unmedicated, undimmed. These moments are true. You hold on to them. The youngest is 5 and lives entirely in the present tense, as 5-year-olds do, which means she wants everything immediately and interprets the slight lag in your responses as a personal betrayal rather than a pharmacological side effect, which is objectively fair. She is furious about things with a frequency and intensity that you find simultaneously exhausting and secretly admirable. She feels everything at full volume. You watch her melt down over a dropped popsicle and think, I remember doing that, metaphorically speaking, and someone handed me something to make me stop, and I'm not sure the stopping was the solution it appeared to be. You do not say this to anyone. It is not the kind of thought you have learned to say out loud. You are a good mother by the operational metrics of 1973, which are: children are fed, children are clean, children attend school, children are not visibly damaged, house is functional, husband is not inconvenienced. By all those measures, you are excellent. The measures do not include: children have full access to their mother's emotional presence. Children know who their mother actually is. Children have watched someone model what it looks like to want something and say so. Those metrics will come later. They will be developed largely by the children of women like you, who grew up behind the glass and spent their adult lives figuring out what was on the other side of it. It is important to understand that you have a social life. You're not a recluse. Every Thursday there is a neighbourhood coffee at Carol's, and you go. Every other Friday there is a dinner party, and you go to that too. You wear your good blouse. You bring a dish. You laugh at the right moments and nod at the right moments, and at no point does anyone suspect that the reason you are so pleasant, so even-keeled, so utterly incapable of being rattled is because you took a pill at 10 in the morning and another one at 2, and the pharmaceutical architecture of your personality is currently holding you upright, like a very subtle internal scaffolding. Carol's Thursday coffees are a sociological event disguised as a casual gathering. 8 women, sometimes 9, sitting in Carol's Harvest Gold kitchen. Everyone in the neighbourhood has a Harvest Gold kitchen. It's as though there was a law, drinking Maxwell House and eating whatever someone brought, which is usually a coffee cake that people eat 3 pieces of and then discuss at length how they really shouldn't. The conversation circles around children, husbands, the neighbourhood, the school board meeting that nobody attended but everyone has opinions about, a television programme, a magazine article, something that happened at the Hendersons that nobody is naming directly but everyone understands. It is pleasant. It is genuinely pleasant. These are not women you dislike. Linda is funny in a way that sneaks up on you. Dorothy knows more about local politics than anyone and delivers the information with the controlled indignation of someone who should absolutely be running for something but never will. Carol herself is a warm and generous host who makes you feel, every Thursday, that your presence in her kitchen matters to her, which is not nothing. But the conversation never goes past a certain depth. There is an invisible line. You can feel its location precisely, the way you can feel the edge of a table in the dark, and the conversation stops reliably before it reaches it. Nobody says, "I am not sure I am happy." Nobody says, "I do not know who I am outside of this kitchen." Nobody says, "I take a small yellow pill that my doctor gave me, and without it the Thursdays are much harder than this." You all know, most of you, that some of the others are taking something. You can identify it by the particular quality of the calm, but it is not spoken. The social contract of the suburb extends into Carol's kitchen on Thursday mornings, and the contract says, "We perform the contentment together, collectively, in coordination, and we do it very well." The dinner parties are louder. Louder means more alcohol, which means the edges come up a bit. Someone says something slightly more honest than intended. Someone's husband makes a joke that lands wrong. Someone laughs too long at something that isn't that funny. The evenings have texture in a way that the Thursdays don't, but they also end, and you drive home, and you think about what was said and what you almost said and what you will never say, and you take your nighttime pill and the thinking settles. Your social life is real. Your friendships are real. They are just conducted at a level of surface area that has been mutually silently agreed upon, because everyone is managing something and nobody is certain what would happen if they stopped. In the 1970s, your family doctor is a man, almost certainly a man, who went to medical school in the 1950s and carries with him a set of assumptions about women that would make a modern therapist develop a facial tic. He believes that female unhappiness is largely a hormonal and social inconvenience, that most women's problems are solved by rest and routine, and that Valium, clean, legal, respectable Valium, is a far more sensible solution than actually examining why a 34-year-old woman with a college education is crying in the grocery store parking lot on a Tuesday for no reason she can name. He renews your prescription without much conversation. He calls you by your husband's last name. He is, by the standards of his time, considered an excellent physician. His waiting room sees a specific proportion of patients that, if you tracked it over the course of a year, would tell you something important. The majority of his afternoon appointments are women in their 30s and 40s, women presenting with fatigue, with sleep disturbance, with vague anxiety, with what the medical literature of the era describes as psychosomatic complaints, a phrase that means, with a politeness that only barely conceals its contempt, "We believe you are experiencing something, but we do not intend to investigate what." He has a framework for these visits. It is the framework of his training, which is the framework of an era in medicine that understood the female nervous system as inherently more volatile than the male one, more susceptible to distress, less amenable to reason, more appropriately managed than engaged. This framework is not cruelty. It is consensus. It is what his professors taught, what his colleagues practice, what the pharmaceutical representatives who take him to lunch reinforce with literature and free samples and golf games. It is the water he swims in, and he is not swimming against it, and nobody around him is suggesting he should. The prescription is efficient. You come in, you describe symptoms, he writes the number 5 and the word milligrams and the word diazepam and slides it across the desk. This takes approximately 90 seconds. What would not be efficient? Asking you about your marriage, your sense of purpose, your daily experience, whether you feel that your intelligence is being used, whether you feel seen by the person you share a bed with, whether the life you're living resembles anything you once wanted from your life. Those conversations would take time. They would produce information he has no training to act on. They would be, in the vocabulary of the 1972 American medical system, outside the scope of what medicine does. What medicine does is treat presenting symptoms. The presenting symptom is anxiety. The treatment is Valium. The follow-up is a 6-month prescription renewal. The medical encounter is complete. You trust him. Of course you trust him. He is your doctor. He has an office with a desk and diplomas on the wall, and he wears a white coat and he calls you by name, even if it is the wrong name, and he projects a confidence that is indistinguishable from where you're sitting, from actual knowledge. You were raised to trust doctors. Your husband trusts doctors. The entire social structure in which you live directs you, in moments of difficulty, toward the authority of people like him. He is the gatekeeper between your distress and the one tool that was ever offered for it. He is also, in the architecture of this particular decade, the last line of defense between you and the 10 years you're about to have. To be absolutely fair to Valium, and fairness is perhaps the most haunting thing you can offer a drug this complicated, it worked. That is the terrible, seductive truth of it. The first time you took one, something that had been vibrating at a low, constant frequency inside your chest simply stopped. Not dramatically, not like a movie, more like the way a refrigerator hum disappears and you only notice the silence afterward and think, oh, it was always that loud. The anxiety that had been pressing against the inside of your ribcage like something trying to get out simply sat down. You sat down with it. The afternoon was suddenly manageable. You felt, for the first time in a long time, something adjacent to fine. This is important to understand, because without it, the rest of the story doesn't make sense. Nobody keeps taking a thing that doesn't work. Nobody builds a daily routine around something that offers nothing. The women who took Valium for years, who organised their mornings around it, who felt its absence in their bodies like a physical ache, they did this because the drug was genuinely, measurably, subjectively effective. It crossed the blood-brain barrier and bound to GABA receptors, and reduced neuronal excitability in ways that produced a real, physiological calm. This is not a placebo. This is pharmacology. The calm was real. What also happened, underneath the calm, was that your brain began adjusting. The nervous system is an adaptive system. It notices chemical changes and compensates for them. When Valium arrived and started reducing the excitability of certain neural pathways, your brain, being a sophisticated and deeply conservative organ, began quietly upregulating its own anxiety response to compensate for the external suppression. It was trying to maintain homeostasis. It was trying to keep the balance. What this meant in practical terms was that the baseline anxiety level you would experience without the drug was slowly, incrementally rising, so that the drug was increasingly necessary not to feel better, but to feel normal. You did not know this was happening. It happened in the vocabulary of neurochemistry, in processes too small and too interior to be visible from where you were standing, which was the kitchen, making coffee, taking the pill, going about your morning. From where you were standing, it felt like medicine working, which it was, technically, just also something else at the same time. The first few months were the clearest window into the drug's actual promise. You slept. You stopped tensing your jaw at dinner. You drove the car without the specific, undirected dread that had been accompanying you on the freeway like an unwelcome passenger. You had a conversation with your husband's mother that would previously have required you to decompress for 2 hours afterward. and instead you felt merely tired by it, which is the appropriate human response to your husband's mother. You thought the drug had fixed something. You thought there had been something wrong with your chemistry, a deficit, an imbalance, a mechanical fault, and that the prescription had corrected it. This was the narrative your doctor offered, and you accepted it, because it was simpler and more actionable than the alternative. The alternative being that nothing was wrong with your chemistry at all. The thing about feeling adjacent to fine is that fine itself starts to seem achievable. And the thing about achievable is that the gap between adjacent to fine and actual fine is exactly 1 more milligram. Valium tolerance builds quietly, the way a draft gets into a house, not through any one crack, but through many small ones over time. The dose that smoothed your edges in 1972 no longer smoothed them in 1973. You mention this to your doctor, who nods and increases the prescription, because that is what one does. You're not taking more than he prescribed. You are, at every step, doing exactly what you were told. This is the part that will not stop being strange. The language around tolerance is worth examining, because the language is part of the trap. Tolerance sounds neutral, clinical. It sounds like a measurement, a fact about your physiology, a thing that simply is, rather than a thing that is happening to you as a direct consequence of a decision someone made in a consulting room. Tolerance sounds like weather. Tolerance sounds like it arrived on its own. What actually happened is that your brain adapted to the presence of the drug in your system and reduced its own production of natural calming chemicals. As a result, why produce what you're already receiving? And when the drug dose needed to rise to compensate for that adaptation, the adaptation continued to track it upward, and the floor of your baseline anxiety kept rising, and the drug kept having to work harder to suppress what was now, in part, a drug-induced elevation of the thing it was prescribed to treat. This is called physiological dependence. In 1973, your doctor called it your body adjusting, which is technically true in the same way that a snowball rolling downhill is technically adjusting to the gradient. The dose goes from 2 milligrams to 5, then from 5 to 10. Some women in this era were taking 30 or 40 milligrams a day by the time the story reached its various conclusions, which represents a dose that, administered to a drug-naive patient today, would be considered a clinical emergency. At the time, it was considered an appropriate response to continuing symptoms. The symptoms were continuing because the drug was producing them. This loop had a logic that was entirely invisible from inside it. Your daily experience during the dose escalation is not one of increasing intoxication. It is not, despite everything, a story about getting high. It is a story about the dial of your emotional range being turned progressively inward. The highs get lower. The lows get softer. The range of what you feel shrinks toward a middle register that is neither distress nor pleasure nor much of anything specific, and you move through your days inside that register, competent and presentable and increasingly distant from anything that could be called a rich interior life. You read this in hindsight. At the time you read it as stability. Stability felt like progress. Progress felt like the goal. Nobody told you the goal had moved. The prescription renewals happen automatically. You call the office, the nurse calls the pharmacy, the pharmacist fills the bottle, you pick it up. There is no checkpoint, no reassessment, no moment at which someone looks at the length of the prescription chain, now 2 years, now 3, and asks whether the original plan is still the right one. The original plan just continues. It continues the way wallpaper continues, the way the avocado kitchen continues, the way many things in 1973 continue, because stopping would require someone to notice that starting was a decision, and nobody is currently interested in noticing that. Your doctor did not give you a pamphlet. There was no informed consent conversation, no list of side effects read aloud in the way a pharmaceutical commercial rattles off its litany of horrors over footage of someone laughing on a beach. You were told it would help with anxiety. You were not told about the fatigue that settles into your bones like wet sand. You were not told about the memory that starts going soft at the edges, the forgotten appointments, the repeated questions, the occasional standing in the kitchen doorway not knowing why you came in. You were not told about the way your coordination gets slightly wrong, The dropped coffee cups, the slow reactions. You were told almost nothing, actually, because in 1973, telling women things about their own medication was not considered a primary medical concern. The fatigue was the first thing you noticed, not sleepiness exactly. You were sleeping fine, too fine. The kind of fine where you could fall asleep sitting up in the afternoon in the chair by the window and wake up an hour later not entirely sure where you were. More a heaviness, a drag, a sensation of moving through something slightly denser than air, as though the house had been subtly pressurized overnight. You mentioned this at your next appointment. Your doctor said it was normal, that your body was still adjusting. He said this about most things, actually, which at some point you noticed and at no point did anything about. The memory issues were more disorienting because they were inconsistent. Not the dramatic forgetting of something serious, not your children's names or the way home, smaller things. The word for something you knew perfectly well that simply was not available when you reached for it. The appointment you'd written on the calendar in your own hand that you had no memory of making. The conversation your husband referenced that you had apparently participated in but that existed in your recall only as a vague outline, a shape without detail. You chalked this up to being busy, to having a lot to track. This was the available explanation and you used it. Coordination problems appeared gradually enough to be easy to rationalize. A broken glass here. A stumble on the front step you attributed to ice, though it was October. The time you misjudged the bottom stair in the dark and sat down hard on the floor, and sat there for a moment thinking nothing in particular, which might be the most Valium-adjacent experience available. Sitting on the floor at the bottom of your own staircase thinking nothing in particular. You got up. You did not mention it to anyone. What was also happening, which you would not have language for until much later, was a gradual interference with the formation of new emotional memories. The drug was not just muting current emotions, it was affecting the way experiences were being encoded so that the years of the prescription would be recalled by many women as slightly flat, slightly grey, slightly less textured than the years before and after. Like looking at photographs of that time versus the photos on either side, technically the same paper, technically the same people, but missing something in the exposure. You are healthy, your doctor says at your annual physical. Blood pressure fine. Heart sounds good. He does not perform a cognitive assessment. He does not ask how your memory is. He asks if the medication is still helping, and you say yes because compared to what? Exactly is a question you no longer have enough distance from the drug to answer. There is a particular quality to the Valium fog that everyone who lived it describes the same way, which is to say, they struggle to describe it at all. It is not unconsciousness. You are awake. You function. You drive. You cook. You have conversations you will mostly remember. It is more like being present inside a room where someone has turned down the contrast on everything. The colours are still there, just slightly less saturated. The feelings are still there, just slightly less sharp. Problems exist, but they exist at a remove, like someone else's problems, interesting to observe but not quite urgent enough to act on. The fog is not unhappiness. The fog is the suspension of unhappiness, which feels for a while exactly like peace. What lived inside the fog was in retrospect a great deal. The fog did not destroy things, it stored them. It put them in a room and turned the light down and closed the door very softly, and the things sat in there, undisturbed and undissolved, waiting with the particular patience of things that have nowhere else to go. Grief, for losses both large and specific and small and nameless. Anger, which is the emotion most effectively suppressed by benzodiazepines, and therefore the one that accumulates most silently. Desire, not only in the obvious sense but in the larger sense, the desire to do something, to be something, to want something, with enough urgency that you would rearrange your life around the wanting. The desire to be known by someone. All of this was in the room, with the light off. You knew the room was there, you didn't open the door. Some women, in later years, described the fog as protective in a way that they found uncomfortable to acknowledge. Protective in the sense that without it, the gap between the life they were living and the life they had once imagined would have been so visible and so painful that they are not sure, honestly, what they would have done with that visibility. The fog made the gap livable. The fog made the days manageable. That is not nothing. That is in fact a significant something. And sitting with that, with the genuine relief that the fog provided, while also holding what the fog cost, is among the more complicated things this story asks of you. Because the fog also made it impossible to change anything. You cannot renegotiate a marriage while you're inside the fog. You cannot decide to go back to school, to take a job, to write the letter to your husband that starts with, "I have something I need to tell you." You cannot do any of the things that a life in need of revision requires, because revision requires a clear view of what needs changing, and the fog's entire mechanism is the management of clarity. Some women came out of the fog and discovered, to their great sadness and occasional relief, that everything they had stored in the room was exactly where they'd left it, perfectly preserved. The feelings had not spoiled or decayed. They were waiting with complete fidelity to their original dimensions. The grief was the same grief. The anger was the same anger. 10 years older, yes, but not smaller. The fog ends and the room opens and you stand at the door blinking in the light. Here is the uncomfortable centre of this entire story. Many of the women being prescribed Valium in the 1970s were not mentally ill. They were not disordered. They were deeply, structurally, sociologically unhappy for reasons that were completely legible and almost entirely unaddressed. They had college degrees they were not using. They had ambitions that had been, gently and persistently, redirected into the shape of a casserole dish. They had husbands who treated them with a kind of benevolent indifference. They had days that were structurally identical to each other, in a way that would make most reasonable people lose their minds. They were not broken. They were a generation of women whose actual problems were not medical, and they were being given a medical solution, and it worked just well enough to prevent them from solving the real problem. The college degree is a good place to start because it is both one of the more measurable aspects of this story and one of the more quietly devastating. In the 1950s and 1960s, women attended college in increasing numbers, and many of them went with real intentions, with real curiosity, with a genuine sense that education was the beginning of something rather than an interlude before domesticity. They studied literature and chemistry and political science and history. They wrote papers. They had opinions. They argued with professors. Some of them were brilliant in ways their professors noted, with the particular rueful regret of people who understand that brilliance is going somewhere that will not require it. Then they graduated, and then they got married, and then the intelligence that had been the primary organising fact of their identity for 4 years was reassigned to shopping lists, to school calendars, to keeping the peace, to managing the emotional climate of a household in a way so total and so invisible that it wasn't even recognised as labour, let alone intellectual labour, let alone labour that warranted compensation or acknowledgement, or the simple recognition that it was being done by someone who could have been doing other things. This is not a small loss. This is not a personal problem. This is a societal arrangement that took an enormous amount of human potential and put it in a house on a cul-de-sac with an avocado kitchen and a prescription for Valium, and called the arrangement successful, and measured its success by the evenness of the woman's affect and the cleanliness of the countertops. The women knew this at some level, even through the fog. The knowing had a specific shape, not the sharp, actionable knowing of something you can name and address, but the blunt, constant knowing of something too large and too structural to see all at once, like trying to look at the whole horizon from inside the horizon. They felt it as dissatisfaction, as restlessness, as the particular melancholy of someone standing in a room that should feel like home and feeling like a visitor. Their doctors called this anxiety. Their doctors were wrong, and the drug that was prescribed for the wrong diagnosis produced an effect that was accurate to the wrong answer. It suppressed the symptom while the cause continued, unexamined and unaddressed, beneath the lovely, controlled, chemically maintained surface. In 1963, a decade before your prescription bottle found its way into your medicine cabinet, a woman named Betty Friedan published a book that many women later described as the literary equivalent of someone turning on a light in a room you didn't realize was dark. The feminine mystique gave a name to something Friedan called the problem that has no name, the creeping, sourceless despair of educated women whose entire identity had been compressed into domesticity. She interviewed hundreds of suburban housewives. She found the same fog, the same disconnection, the same quiet drowning beneath perfectly clean surfaces. Friedan did not write about Valium. The drug was barely in circulation yet, but she wrote about the exact psychological conditions that would, within a decade, make America's doctors reach for it. The problem that has no name. Sit with that phrase for a moment. Because a problem that has no name is a problem that cannot be argued with, cannot be pointed at, cannot be brought to a doctor and diagnosed and addressed. It is a problem that lives in the space between what you can articulate and what you can actually feel, which is a space that a prescription can fill very neatly without resolving anything about the space itself. Friedan's research was methodical and, by the standards of 1963, radical. She wrote about the gap between what the dominant culture told women their lives should feel like, meaningful, fulfilling, naturally complete through marriage and motherhood, and what those lives actually felt like to the women living them. She called the dominant culture's story a mystique, a carefully constructed narrative that served the economic interests of post-war America by directing women toward consumption and domesticity, and that served the psychological interests of an entire generation of men by producing homes that functioned, children who were cared for, and wives who were emotionally available without being professionally competitive. The book sold enormously. It was discussed in living rooms and coffee shops and the kinds of women's magazines that did not normally publish material that made their readers feel that their entire life arrangement was a culturally manufactured trap. Some women read it and wept with recognition. Some women read it and felt for the first time that their unhappiness was not a personal failing but a systemic one, not evidence of their deficiency but of the structures. Some women's husbands read it and were confused and slightly hostile. Some women's husbands did not read it. By the time Valium was becoming the most prescribed drug in America in the late 1960s, Friedan's book had been in print for 6 years. The problem had been named. The name had not changed anything structural. The doctors were still prescribing, and the women were still filling the prescriptions, because a named problem that no one is taking action on is functionally identical, from the inside, to a problem that has no name. Friedan went on to help found the National Organization for Women in 1966. She spent the rest of her life arguing for structural change, for equal employment, for reproductive rights, for the treatment of women as something other than a demographic to be managed. She was right. She was also, in the 1970s, largely talking to a generation of women who were, at that precise moment, on something that made urgency feel optional. Roche Pharmaceuticals did not get Valium into 50 million American medicine cabinets by accident. They marketed it with a precision that should be studied in medical ethics courses and frequently is. Their advertisements ran in medical journals targeting doctors directly, and the imagery was strikingly consistent. A woman, always a woman, looking overwhelmed by ordinary life. The ad showed housewives anxious about cooking, mothers frayed by children, women described as suffering from the tension and anxiety of everyday adjustment. The prescription was not framed as treatment for a disorder. It was framed as a reasonable chemical response to being a woman in a domestic environment. Roche essentially argued that suburban life was a medical condition, and they had the cure. One of the most often cited advertisements from this era showed a woman, middle-aged, middle-class, surrounded by the visual vocabulary of domestic competence, above copy that described her anxiety not in clinical terms, but in terms of her failure to perform her domestic role adequately. She was anxious because she could not cope. The implication was clear. Valium would restore the coping. Valium would make her functional again. The definition of functional being as ever, the smooth execution of domestic labour without visible distress. There were ads aimed at male patients too, but the numbers tell the story of where the focus was. Women were prescribed Valium at roughly double the rate of men throughout this period. The advertising reflects both the cause and the effect of this disparity. Women were shown as the natural recipients of chemical intervention against daily life. Men were shown, when they appeared at all, as subject to the stresses of achievement and professional pressure, a different, more external, more dignified species of suffering. Female anxiety was domestic. Male anxiety was circumstantial. Male anxiety, the implication ran, had an identifiable external cause. Female anxiety was simply a feature of being female, best managed rather than investigated. This is pharmaceutical advertising at its most culturally revealing. Not because it invented these assumptions. The assumptions were already there, embedded in the medical training of every doctor receiving the journals, but because it articulated them so cleanly and so profitably. Roche found the cultural current and sold it a boat. The current was already moving. Roche just made the movement more efficient. What the advertising never showed. What the women in those ads actually needed. The ad in which a housewife's anxiety is resolved by someone asking her what she actually wants from her life was not produced by Roche Pharmaceuticals because it had no pill to sell. The ad in which a doctor asks the necessary questions and refers the patient to a therapist or a divorce attorney or a graduate school admissions office was not produced because it did not serve the relevant commercial interests. What was produced was the image of calm, the woman restored to smooth, frictionless domestic function. The image of the prescription as a kindness, as care, as medicine doing what medicine should do. And this image was printed in the journals that doctors read, which shaped the assumptions that doctors carried into consulting rooms, which shaped the conversations that sent women home with orange bottles and 8-minute appointments, and the feeling, briefly, of being taken care of. You were taken care of right into 10 years of dependency, but the advertisement was very well designed. This is where the story becomes genuinely uncomfortable, and where it deserves to be held carefully. At what point does the woman who follows her doctor's instructions become an addict? The answer, it turns out, is that the line between the two was drawn by everyone except the woman herself. Valium's physical dependence was well documented by the early 1970s, within medical literature, the same literature your doctor read, the same literature Roche published in. But the word addiction was not being applied to middle-class housewives taking a legal drug prescribed by a licensed physician. Addiction was something that happened to other people, in other neighbourhoods, in other circumstances. What you had was a prescription. The distinction mattered enormously to everyone except your nervous system, which was becoming quietly, chemically dependent in a way that no one was planning to address. The cultural construction of who is and is not an addict is one of the most durable and well-maintained fictions in American social life. The addict of the 1970s, in the popular imagination, was young, probably male, probably poor, probably urban, probably black or brown, probably holding a needle or a pipe, probably having made a series of bad and freely chosen decisions that led to a foreseeable and partially deserved outcome. This image had been constructed with considerable care over several decades by media, by law enforcement narratives, by the particular moral vocabulary that American culture applies to suffering when the suffering is occurring in people it has already decided to regard with suspicion. The housewife in the suburb was not that person. She was the moral inverse of that person. She was respectable. She was compliant. She was following instructions. She had a prescription on file at a legitimate pharmacy. She took the correct dosage, adjusted upward only at her physician's recommendation, and she stored the medication in the medicine cabinet rather than in her bra or a shoebox under the bed. The structural and behavioural profile of her dependence was, by every available social metric, entirely respectable. And this respectability was precisely what made it invisible. Because addiction was something you could be held accountable for, a failure of will, a moral collapse, but dependence resulting from proper medical compliance was something else, something that sat in an uncomfortable space between medicine and catastrophe that the system had not really prepared anyone to describe. So mostly it was not described. It was continued. There is a word, iatrogenic, that means caused by the medical treatment itself. Iatrogenic addiction, dependence produced by following your doctor's orders, is not a category the medical system of the 1970s was comfortable populating with suburban housewives. Recognizing it as such would have required a reckoning with the prescribing patterns that produced it, which would have required a reckoning with the assumptions that drove the prescribing, which would have required the whole apparatus to look at what it had done to a generation of women and call it something true. That reckoning came slowly, incompletely, and considerably too late for many of the women who needed it. Nobody told you that you couldn't stop. Why would they? You were not an addict. You were a patient. But the day you run out of refills and your doctor is on vacation and you decide, reasonably, to simply not take one, that day teaches you something about your own body that no one thought to mention in advance. Valium withdrawal is not uncomfortable in the way a hangover is uncomfortable. Valium withdrawal is medically serious, potentially life-threatening if done abruptly, and characterized by anxiety so profound and physical symptoms so disorienting that many women described it as the worst experience of their lives, which is particularly stunning when you consider that what they were withdrawing from was a drug prescribed specifically to treat anxiety. The cure and the disease had, at some point, become the same thing. The first day without the pill, you notice an absence. The way you notice a filling has fallen out, not immediately agonizing, but wrong. The tongue returning to it compulsively, the brain circling around the gap. By the second day, something that is not anxiety but is anxiety's larger, angrier cousin has moved into your chest. It is physiologically real. Your heart rate is elevated. Your hands have a tremor you can see when you hold them up. A fine vibration, almost elegant, like something tuned too tight. You're sweating. The house feels different, brighter at the edges, too loud. The refrigerator's hum you never noticed, now something you cannot not notice. By the third day, what is happening to you is a medical emergency that looks, from the outside, like a nervous breakdown. Because from the outside, it does look like that. Your husband comes home to find you sitting on the kitchen floor, not crying exactly. Something before crying, something that would produce crying if it could find a sufficient container for itself and cannot. He asks if you're all right, and you cannot explain to him what is happening because you don't have the language, and because he doesn't know about the pills. He has never known about the pills, which is both a fact about your marriage and a fact about your medicine cabinet. And so you say you're not feeling well, and he makes you a cup of tea and watches the news. Benzodiazepine withdrawal can cause seizures. This is not a metaphor or a scare statistic. It is a documented physiological fact that abrupt cessation of benzodiazepines after long-term use can produce grand mal seizures in otherwise healthy adults. This was known. It was in the literature. It was not routinely communicated to patients being prescribed the drug for years at a time, because the literature and the prescription were living in different rooms of the same building, and no one had been assigned to introduce them. You call the doctor's office. A locum tells you to restart the prescription and make an appointment. You restart the prescription. Within 4 hours, you feel the fog return, soft and familiar, and you sit in it feeling something that is relief and shame and recognition all at once. You never tried to stop again without supervision. Or you did try, and it went worse. Or you never tried at all because you learned, that day on the kitchen floor, something about the geography of your own dependency that changed what you thought was possible. Not everyone's story ends at the medicine cabinet. Some women, in the depths of the fog or in a terrifying moment of clarity through it, took too many. Sometimes deliberately. Sometimes in the confused cotton-wrapped haze of a tolerance so high that the gap between therapeutic dose and dangerous dose had narrowed without anyone noticing. Valium overdose, particularly when combined with alcohol, and in the 1970s the combination of tranquilizers and cocktail hour was practically a social institution, could be and was fatal. The statistics from this era are genuinely hard to look at. Women were dying from the thing their doctors gave them to help them live, and the deaths were being categorized, filed, and largely not interrogated with any urgency. The death certificate said things like accidental overdose, drug interaction, natural causes complicated by sedative medication. They said the things that death certificates say when the documentation is accurate, but the context is missing. They did not say, this woman was prescribed a dependency-forming drug for a decade by a physician who renewed the prescription every 6 months without assessment. They did not say, this woman's tolerance was so high that her safe dose and her lethal dose had become essentially adjacent, separated by 1 glass of wine at a dinner party at Carol's. They said the procedurally correct thing. The full story required more space than a death certificate provides. The women who overdose deliberately are the harder part of this story to look at, and they deserve to be looked at. Because the fog did not prevent suffering, it stored it, as we've discussed, in the room with the light off. And there were women for whom the fog thinned unexpectedly, in a particular season, after a particular loss, or simply as tolerance climbed and the drug's ability to suppress the room's contents diminished. And what they encountered in those thin moments was not manageable, not without help, and help was not available in any form they had been given access to, because their doctor had a prescription pad and not a crisis intervention protocol, and their friends had their own orange bottles and the social contract of the suburb, and their husbands had the news on and a scotch poured. The suicide rate among women in this demographic is not a number that was loudly reported at the time. It did not produce congressional hearings. It did not generate pharmaceutical company press releases expressing concern. It produced death certificates. It produced the specific grief of families who understood, at some level, that something had gone very wrong, but could not locate the accountability inside the chain of events that led there. These women are part of this story. They are not the story's footnote or its warning. They are its evidence of what the system produced when it decided that the appropriate response to female unhappiness was chemical management rather than genuine care. They deserved better. That sentence is inadequate. It is also true. Let's talk about the other bottle, because in the 1970s suburb, Valium rarely travelled alone. The afternoon scotch, the pre-dinner gin and tonic, the wine that appeared at 4:30 with a frequency that would concern a modern addiction counsellor, but in 1973 was simply called winding down. Alcohol and benzodiazepines are a pharmacologically dangerous combination, both depressants working on the same receptors, both enhancing the effect of the other, both contributing to the same fog at increasing depth. Your doctor knew this, theoretically. He prescribed the pills anyway. The combination made the fog thicker, the responses slower, the emotional numbness more complete. It also made the dependency deeper, and the eventual withdrawal more dangerous. Nobody was connecting these dots in the afternoon kitchen. Nobody was connecting them in the doctor's office either. Alcohol in the 1970s suburb was not the object of scrutiny it would later become. Drinking was social, domestic, unremarkable. The cocktail hour was an institution, a real one, with its own rituals, its own glassware, its own signal to the household that the working day was over, which in a suburb meant that your husband had come home, and the invisible second shift, the emotional management of the evening, was beginning. The wine with dinner, the after-dinner brandy if it was that kind of night, the nightcap. None of this was considered a problem. All of it was considered normal. The wine was not self-medication, officially. It was just wine. The Valium was not addiction, officially. It was just medication. The combination of the two was not a crisis, officially. It was just a 1973 afternoon. The pharmacology was less relaxed about the official categorizations. Alcohol and benzodiazepines both work on GABA receptors, both enhance inhibitory neurotransmission, both slow the central nervous system, both produce sedation, and when combined they do not simply add their effects together but multiply them, each one making the other more potent. A glass of wine with 2 milligrams of Valium is not equivalent to a glass of wine or 2 milligrams of Valium. It is something larger than either. Several glasses of wine with 10 milligrams of Valium in a woman with 3 years of tolerance is a number that the system was not calculating. The physical consequences accumulated slowly, impaired coordination dismissed as clumsiness, slow reactions dismissed as fatigue, memory gaps dismissed as being a busy mother in a busy decade. Some women developed what would now be recognized as alcohol use disorder alongside their benzodiazepine dependence, the two conditions reinforcing each other and both invisible beneath the social acceptability of their respective containers, the prescription bottle and the wine glass, both legitimate, both unremarkable, both in the kitchen. Some women knew, on some level, that the afternoon glass of wine and the morning pill were performing the same function. They knew it the way you know something that you have decided not to examine directly, peripherally, sideways, in the space just beside your line of sight. The knowing sat there, patient and quiet, alongside everything else in the room with the light off, waiting. Here is the perspective that the story rarely offers: the children. The kids who grew up in these houses, now adults, many of them, articulate and complicated about what they remember, describe something specific and strange about the mothers of this era. Not cruelty, not neglect in any recognizable form, something harder to name, a quality of presence that was slightly off, a mother who was there but not quite reachable, warm but sealed inside something invisible, responsive but as if responding from a slight delay. They describe childhoods that were materially comfortable and emotionally puzzling. They describe learning early not to need too much, not to ask too loudly, to interpret a certain soft vacancy in their mother's eyes as simply how mothers were. Some of them are still unpacking this. Some of them became therapists. Some of them became writers. Almost all of them eventually found out about the orange bottle. The children were not stupid. Children are never stupid about the emotional texture of the household they grow up in. They do not have the vocabulary for what they're observing, and they do not have the framework to contextualize it, but they notice everything. The quality of your presence at the dinner table, the way your responses sometimes arrive just slightly after the moment has passed, the particular quality of your attention when it is full and present, versus when it is the same face wearing attention like a coat. They noticed. They catalogued, they learned. What they learned, and this is not their fault, and it is also one of the story's lasting costs, is that emotional absence is a feature of how adults manage difficult things. That when the pressure gets too high, you find something to lower it. That the correct response to a life that is more than you can carry is to make the carrying feel lighter, rather than to put down some of the load. That management of feeling is more available and more acceptable than expression of it. Some of them internalized this so completely that it took them years of adult life and sometimes years of therapy to find the edge of it. Some of the daughters grew up and watched their own doctors reach for the prescription pad and recognized the gesture from the medicine cabinet of their childhood. Some said yes. Some said no with a clarity that surprised them. A refusal that came not from knowledge of pharmacology, but from a cellular, pre-verbal memory of watching something be managed rather than lived. Some of the sons grew up and married women they expected to manage things, and were confused and hurt when those women eventually stopped. The inheritance was real. It was not the drug itself. The children did not take the drug, mostly. It was the architecture of emotional management that the drug both produced and symbolized. The lesson that ran quietly beneath the avocado kitchen and the harvest gold carpet. This is how we do it. We don't say, we cope, we smooth. We keep the house clean, and the husband fed and the children properly dressed. And when the keeping and the smoothing gets to be more than we can carry, we find something that makes the weight feel like nothing. That lesson ran forward in time. Some of it is still running. In the early 1970s, something started showing up in the suburb that had not been invited. Consciousness. Betty Friedan's book had been out for a decade. Gloria Steinem was on the cover of magazines. Ms. Magazine launched in 1972. The women's liberation movement was making noise in cities, on campuses, in newspapers, and its ideas were seeping, slowly, and not entirely welcomely, into the cul-de-sacs. Some women in your neighbourhood thought it was ridiculous. Some thought it was dangerous. Some read Gloria Steinem at the kitchen table while their husband was at work and felt something shift in the walls of the house around them in a way that was interesting and frightening in equal measure. The pill made it easier to ignore the shift. It also, quietly, made some women wonder what they had been smoothing over all this time and whether they wanted to stop. The relationship between the women's liberation movement and Valium is one of the odder historical juxtapositions of the decade, and one of the more structurally revealing. Here, at the same moment in American history, you had a mass political movement arguing that women's unhappiness was the product of structural oppression and deserved structural solutions: equal rights, equal pay, reproductive autonomy, the full recognition of women as subjects with interiority and ambition and the right to define their own lives. And you also had the most widely prescribed drug in American history being administered primarily to women, functioning to reduce the urgency of exactly the feelings that the movement was attempting to harness. It is not that the drug was politically motivated. It is not a conspiracy. It is something more prosaic and therefore more disturbing. It is simply that the drug was doing, on a neurochemical level, what the culture was attempting to do on a social level: keep the women manageable, and it was doing it more efficiently. Some women found their way to the movement through the withdrawal, literal and metaphorical, from the fog. Women who stopped taking Valium, or began tapering, or found that their dose was no longer sufficient to contain things, found themselves sitting with feelings that were, once names were applied to them, recognizably political. The anger was not personal neurosis. The anger was an accurate response to an accurate assessment of a situation that was genuinely unjust. Meeting that anger at a consciousness-raising group, in a room full of women describing structurally identical situations, could be revelatory in a way that the Thursday coffees at Carol's were specifically not set up to be. Other women found the movement confusing or threatening, because the movement was asking them to value the very things that the last decade of their lives had been organized around devaluing: their intelligence, their ambition, their right to want something beyond the house. To be told, at 38, after 10 years of a life built on a particular premise, that the premise was wrong, that is not a comfortable revelation. That is the kind of revelation that requires somewhere to put the anger at having been wrong, and somewhere to put the grief at the time it cost, and somewhere to put the complicated feeling of being, simultaneously, the victim of a structure and a willing participant in it. The fog helped with all of that. Some women stayed in the fog rather than feel the movement's particular clarity. You cannot fully blame them. Clarity has costs that comfort doesn't. Some women, in the mid-1970s, tried to stop. Some tried because the movement made them want to feel something again. Some tried because a friend died. Some tried because they were just tired. Tired of the fog. Tired of the distance between themselves and their own lives. Tired of loving their children through glass. What they found when they tried was that quitting Valium without medical supervision was an experience that could produce seizures, hallucinations, and a return of anxiety so amplified it bore no relationship to the original complaint. Many of them went back to the pills, not because they wanted to, because nothing in the medical system was set up to help them through the other side, and the other side, unassisted, was genuinely unbearable. The women who tried to quit did so largely in private, which is both historically consistent and practically significant. They did not announce it at Thursday coffee. They did not call their doctor and say, "I believe I am dependent on the medication you prescribed, and I would like help stopping." Some did call their doctors and were told to continue the prescription because the symptoms of withdrawal were being read as evidence of the underlying anxiety the drug was treating, a circle so closed it had no visible seam. Some were told not to stop abruptly, given no guidance beyond that, and left to navigate the mechanism of their own dependency with no map and no support. What withdrawal from long-term benzodiazepine use actually requires, what would, in later decades, be understood and recommended, is a slow, carefully managed taper over months or sometimes years, reducing the dose in small increments and allowing the brain time to recalibrate its own chemistry at each step. This is not quick. It is not comfortable. It requires medical oversight, access to mental health support, and a domestic situation stable enough to tolerate the process, none of which were being reliably provided to the women who needed them in 1975. Some women found each other. This is one of the less celebrated and more important facts of this era. Women who were trying to get off the pills, who were experiencing the withdrawal and looking for someone who understood it from the inside, sometimes found each other in the spaces the women's movement was creating: consciousness-raising groups, women's health collectives, the early networks of what would become feminist therapy. They compared experiences. They validated each other's symptoms as real and physiological rather than evidence of mental fragility. They developed informal protocols that sometimes resembled, at a lay level, what medical best practice would eventually codify. The ones who made it through described the experience in similar terms. It was the hardest thing they had ever done. Harder than childbirth, harder than grief, harder than anything the fog had been protecting them from. And on the other side of it was something they had not expected, not just the absence of dependence, but the presence of a self they had not fully inhabited for years, sharp, sometimes uncomfortable, capable of full volume feeling, recognizably, unmistakably theirs. Some of them were angry. They had every right to be. Many of them were also, despite everything, grateful to feel it. In 1979, a television producer named Barbara Gordon published a memoir called "I'm Dancing as Fast as I Can," and it is probably the most important document to come out of this entire era that most people have never read. Gordon was a successful, high-functioning professional, not a suburban housewife, but a working woman who became dependent on Valium after years of medical prescriptions, and then suffered a catastrophic collapse when she abruptly stopped taking it on her doctor's advice. Her account of withdrawal, of the psychiatric hospitalization that followed, of the medical system's failure to understand what it had done to her, it is stunning, detailed, and should have changed everything. It briefly did. The book became a bestseller. A film was made. Doctors were briefly uncomfortable, and then largely the prescriptions continued. Gordon was an Emmy-winning documentary filmmaker. She was educated, articulate, professionally successful, and in every social sense the kind of person to whom the label addiction was not expected to apply. This was, of course, precisely why her book landed the way it did. She was too recognizable, too respectable, too obviously not the addict of the cultural imagination for the reader to maintain a comfortable distance from her experience. She was your colleague, she was your neighbour. She was, in the very specific way that the most effective memoirs are, you. Her account of the withdrawal is harrowing in the specific physiological way of someone describing something that actually happened to their body. The shaking, the terror, the way reality became unreliable in the weeks after she stopped. Not dramatically, not cinematically, but in the subtle and profoundly disorienting way of someone whose nervous system has had its external regulation removed and is attempting, chaotically, to recalibrate. The psychiatric hospitalization that followed was not helpful in the way hospitalizations are supposed to be helpful. The psychiatrists she encountered were operating largely with the same set of assumptions about female psychology that had produced the prescription in the first place. Her distress read as inherent, as pathological, as something to be managed rather than understood as the direct physiological consequence of benzodiazepine dependence. The book was read by hundreds of thousands of people. It appeared on the New York Times bestseller list. The film starred Jill Clayburgh and was reasonably well received. In medical schools and continuing education programs it was briefly cited. For a moment the conversation that needed to happen seemed on the verge of happening, and then the moment passed. The prescriptions continued. The medical infrastructure that had produced the crisis had not changed in any structural way. It had simply acknowledged at arm's length that a problem existed and then returned to the office. Gordon's book is still in print. It still reads as contemporary. This is either an endorsement of its staying power or an indictment of how little the underlying patterns have changed, and it is probably both. By the late 1970s, the evidence was difficult to ignore, even for those inclined to ignore things. Congressional hearings were held on the overuse of tranquilizers. Senator Edward Kennedy, in 1979, called Valium a menace to public health and cited its dependence-producing properties in language that made Roche Pharmaceuticals visibly unhappy. Studies were published. Investigative journalists wrote stories. The phrase benzodiazepine dependence entered medical literature with increasing frequency and increasing concern. For a moment, it seemed as though the medical establishment might genuinely reckon with what it had done to a generation of women who had been chemically managed rather than heard, sedated rather than helped, and prescribed a solution to a problem nobody had bothered to properly define. The Kennedy hearings are worth pausing on because they are the clearest example available of how close the reckoning came and how much it missed. Kennedy was Senator of Massachusetts and the chair of the Senate Subcommittee on Health. He had access to evidence, to researchers, to the kind of platform that could produce genuine policy change. He used it. The hearings in 1979 put Roche executives in front of cameras and put the prescribing data into the public record. The numbers were extraordinary. The dependence evidence was clear. Kennedy was angry in the specific and performative way of a senator who knows the cameras are rolling, and also, it should be said, appears to have genuinely meant it. Roche responded the way pharmaceutical companies respond to existential challenges, with lawyers, lobbyists, and a willingness to acknowledge the narrowest possible version of the problem. Yes, long-term use could produce physical dependence in some patients. Yes, prescribing guidelines might warrant review. No, this was not the company's responsibility, or at least not its primary one. The prescribing decisions were made by physicians. The patients were under medical supervision. The drug was approved by the FDA and had been prescribed in compliance with all relevant regulations. The problem, in Roche's accounting, was the implementation, not the product. This accounting was not accepted by everyone and was accepted by enough people to prevent anything decisive from happening. Prescribing guidelines were adjusted. Some restrictions were introduced. The DEA reclassified Valium as a controlled substance in 1976 before the hearings, which added a layer of regulatory oversight that slowed but didn't stop the prescribing. The drug remained widely prescribed. Its successors, Xanax, Ativan, Klonopin, moved into the space that tightened Valium prescribing created, carrying the same mechanism, the same dependence profile, and a fresh round of patients who did not know what they were getting into. The reckoning almost happened. It produced some changes at the margins and left the centre largely intact. This is, historically, how reckonings tend to go when the thing being reckoned with is profitable. Recovery, for those who found it, was rarely neat and almost never quick. The women who successfully came off Valium in the late 1970s and early 80s typically did so through slow, carefully managed tapering, a process that could take months or years, accompanied by anxiety that was real and had to be met by something other than a pill. Some women found therapy, which was just beginning to feel less stigmatized. Some found each other, support groups, consciousness-raising circles, rooms where women talked about what had actually been happening behind the perfectly clean windows. Many of them describe recovery not just as withdrawal from a drug, but as an almost archaeological process of excavating the feelings that had been buried since the prescription began, sorting through what had always been there and what the fog had hidden, and deciding what to do with all of it now that they could feel it again. The tapering was managed, when it was managed well, by doctors who had read the emerging literature and understood that the nervous system that had been suppressed for years required time to rebuild its own capacity for equilibrium. The dose reduced in increments measured in fractions of milligrams. The schedule stretched over months. Some women tapered over years. The process was uncomfortable in a way that did not peak and resolve, but rather moved through phases, weeks of heightened anxiety followed by weeks of relative stability, followed by another increment and another adjustment. What the tapering required was an interior resource that the drug had, for years, been substituting for. the capacity to tolerate discomfort, to sit with anxiety without immediately resolving it, to feel the feeling and observe that it passed rather than reaching for something to make it pass faster. This capacity does not disappear during long-term benzodiazepine use, but it does atrophy. It has to be rebuilt the way a muscle rebuilds after injury, slowly, through use, through the repeated experience of feeling something and surviving the feeling. Therapy was the technology that many women used for this rebuilding, and here is where the story of recovery becomes, in some ways, the story that the prescription should have initiated in the first place. In therapy, the problem that had no name finally got named. The structural unhappiness, the unused intelligence, the marriages built on mutual incomprehension, the identity compressed into domestic function, the anger that had been stored in the room with the light off for a decade, all of it came out and could be examined. Some women looked at it and decided to change their marriages. Some decided to end them. Some went back to school. Some took jobs they had postponed indefinitely and discovered that indefinitely had been a choice. Some simply learned, for the first time, to want something and say so. Recovery looked like waking up. Not all at once, not from a good dream, but gradually, the way winter ends, incrementally and then suddenly, and you find yourself in the backyard without the housecoat and the light has changed and something that has been waiting for a long time is finally beginning. Some husbands, late in the story, finally looked up. Some because their wife attempted suicide. Some because she asked for a divorce and meant it. Some because the kids came home from college and said something impossible to dismiss. And some because the woman they had been married to for 15 years suddenly, terrifyingly, had opinions again, strong ones, expressed with a directness and a clarity that the Valium years had smoothed away to nothing. And it turned out that beneath all that careful pleasantness, there had been a person with things she wanted and things she would no longer accept, and she had spent the best part of a decade at a dose that kept that person politely at a distance. Some husbands rose to this, some did not. Both outcomes were entirely predictable from where they were standing. The ones who rose to it had to reckon, first, with having not noticed. This is not a comfortable thing to reckon with. To understand that your wife had been taking a dependency-forming medication for 8 years, and that you did not know, that the woman you had eaten dinner with every evening for 8 years had been partially chemically absent, and you had not noticed her absence. This requires a level of self-examination that some men in 1979 were equipped for and some were not. The ones who were not tended to respond to the revelation with something that looked like hurt feelings, as though the secrecy were the issue rather than the system that made secrecy the path of least resistance. The ones who were equipped for it, who sat down, who asked the questions they should have been asking years ago, who listened to the answers without flinching, who took the information that their wife had been managing something profound and private, and chose to understand rather than defend. Those marriages sometimes became, in the years after, something they had never quite been before. More honest, more balanced, more like a conversation between two people who were actually visible to each other. Some of those husbands would later describe this period as the beginning of their real marriage, as opposed to the domestic arrangement that had preceded it. Some of the divorces were also described this way by the women involved, not as failures but as conclusions, the appropriate end of something that had run its course and been maintained past its natural terminus by a combination of social pressure, dependent children, and a drug that made the maintenance feel like stability. The husbands who did not rise to it tended to treat the changes in their wives as problems, as the introduction of an instability where stability had previously and conveniently existed. They preferred the wife who was smooth, the wife who did not have strong opinions about the marriage, the wife who managed things. They had built their lives on the scaffold of her management, and the removal of the scaffold looked, from inside their life, like demolition. These marriages usually ended too. They just ended later and more painfully and with considerably more legal paperwork. The generation of daughters who grew up watching their mothers move through life at a chemical remove learned something about womanhood that was not on any curriculum. They learned that female distress was manageable, that inconvenient feelings had solutions, that the gap between who you were and what your life required of you could be bridged, not by changing the life, but by adjusting the woman. Some of these daughters, when their own doctors handed them their first prescriptions, Valium by then giving way to Xanax and Ativan, and a new generation of very similar solutions, recognized something, a familiar shape. A door they had been standing outside of since childhood offered now as an entrance. Some walked through it. Some turned around. The ones who turned around often did so because of something specific they remembered, not as concept but as physical memory, carried in the body with the particular fidelity of childhood observations. The shape of their mother's face when she was in the fog, the specific texture of conversations that ended before they should have, the way their mother stood at the kitchen window watching them play, present and unreachable at the same time. They turned the prescription over in their hands in the doctor's office and recognized the weight of it. Not its pharmacological weight, but its social weight, the cultural compact it represented, the long line of women behind them who had said yes to that weight and what that yes had cost. Some of them became outspoken about mental health treatment in ways that mystified their mothers. They went to therapy before they were in crisis rather than after. They described their feelings in sessions with a precision and a comfort that reflected years of having watched feeling go unnamed and unspoken, and having decided somewhere along the way that they wanted something else. They asked their doctors what the mechanism was. They asked about dependence. They asked questions that their mothers had not known to ask and that their mothers' doctors had not been planning to answer. Some of the daughters also watched the pattern repeating themselves before they recognized it for what it was. They found themselves, at 30-something, in a life that looked right from the outside and felt slightly wrong from the inside. And they recognized the feeling not as a pathology to be medicated, but as information to be used. Some of them used it. Some of them needed help using it. Some of them needed more help than the culture was offering, which is its own continuation of the story. The inheritance was not a destiny. It was a tendency, a groove worn into a landscape by water, which the next generation of water could follow or divert around. The daughters who diverted did so through effort and knowledge, and often through the knowledge that they had seen the groove from the inside and knew what it led to. That knowledge was given to them by their mothers' lives. It was not the gift their mothers intended to give, but it was real, and it was useful, and some of those daughters used it. Valium did not disappear. It is still prescribed today, still a controlled substance, still medically legitimate in specific contexts and for specific durations. What changed was the acknowledgement, slow, incomplete, professionally uncomfortable, that it had been used badly, broadly, and with a gender-specific carelessness that amounted to something more than an error in clinical judgment. The DSM added benzodiazepine dependence as a diagnosis. Medical schools began teaching about the risks. Prescribing guidelines changed. The conversation about women's mental health broadened haltingly towards something that at least gestured at the actual conditions of women's actual lives. It was not enough. It was not fast enough. It was not an apology. But it was a change in direction, and for the women who had been waiting for someone in a white coat to acknowledge that something had gone wrong, it was at least a beginning. The change came at different speeds in different places and was driven by different forces in different rooms. In the research literature, it came through the accumulating weight of evidence, study after study documenting dependence, withdrawal, long-term cognitive effects, and a prescribing demographic that was impossible to look at without noticing the gender disparity. In the clinical world, it came through practitioners who encountered patients whose presentations could only be explained by the prescriptions they were taking, and who had the intellectual honesty to follow that explanation to its conclusion. In the regulatory world, it came through the DEA classification, the Kennedy hearings, the gradual tightening of prescribing windows that made years-long prescriptions harder to maintain without scrutiny. What it did not come through, notably, was a formal process of accountability directed at the pharmaceutical company that had marketed a dependency-forming drug to women using advertising that explicitly positioned female unhappiness as a medical indication for long-term pharmacological management. Roche was not sanctioned in any way that resembled proportionality. The class action litigation that followed produced settlements without admissions. The executives who oversaw the marketing campaigns retired with their reputations intact. The money that had been made during the Valium decade was not redistributed toward the treatment of the people made dependent by the drug's use. This is historically consistent. It is also worth noting. What did change meaningfully was the education of the next generation of physicians. Medical training in the 1980s began incorporating slowly, unevenly, and with the particular reluctance of an institution revising its own assumptions, the evidence of benzodiazepine dependence in a way that shifted, at least in theory, the default toward caution. Prescribing guidelines began specifying shorter durations. 2 to 4 weeks became the recommended ceiling for continuous benzodiazepine use in the treatment of anxiety, a recommendation that, if it had been in place a decade earlier, would have prevented an enormous proportion of the dependency that defined the Valium era. Introduced after the damage was done, it prevented some of the next round. The women who had already accumulated years of dependency on the drug had to navigate their way off it, largely without the benefit of the new framework, which was being built around them in real time and at insufficient speed. Many of them tapered successfully over years, with the support of practitioners who understood the mechanism and managed it carefully. Many more tapered without adequate support, relapsed, restarted, and lived for years in the intermediate space between dependency and recovery, never quite fully in either state. And some never got off the drug at all, not because they didn't want to, but because the attempt was sufficiently destabilizing that they and their doctors, when their doctors were paying attention, concluded that the cost of tapering outweighed the cost of continued management. These women made the most pragmatic decision available to them, given the information and the support on offer. They deserve neither judgment nor condescension for it. The conversation about women's mental health that broadened in the wake of the Valium reckoning was an improvement on what preceded it, which is a low bar that it cleared by varying margins. The introduction of SSRIs in the late 1980s and through the 1990s brought a new pharmacological toolkit that was, in genuine and important ways, different from the benzodiazepines, different mechanism, different dependence profile, different clinical indications. They also arrived with some of the same marketing infrastructure, the same demographic targeting, the same cultural positioning of female distress as primarily pharmacological in origin, and the same absence of a serious parallel investment in structural interventions. The drugs changed. The framework around the drugs changed less. What also changed, and this matters, was the agency of women in the conversation. Women in the 1980s and 90s were better positioned by the women's health movement, by the expansion of feminist therapy, by the slow democratization of medical information, to ask questions of their doctors that their predecessors had not known to ask. What is the mechanism? How long is this prescribed for? What happens if I want to stop? Is this treating a condition or managing symptoms? These are not exotic questions. They are the basic questions of an informed patient participating in their own care. They became more available to more women over time, which is progress. The progress was built in part on the foundation of everything that had gone wrong before it. The women of the Valium generation are, in this sense, among the reasons that the next generation was better equipped. This is not a consolation, but it is real. The medical establishment moved on the way large institutions always move on from their errors, by not calling them errors, by building new structures around the old wreckage rather than clearing the wreckage first, by absorbing the criticism into its training and its literature without fully incorporating its implications into its practice, and by producing, in the next generation, something better than what it had offered before, while remaining constitutionally reluctant to account for the gap between the two. It moved on. The women it had harmed did not have the option of moving on at the same pace. Their bodies and their lives operated on a different timeline than the institutional one. Some of them are still on that timeline. Some of them would have things to say about how the moving on felt from inside it, if anyone had been asking with genuine attention. Some were asked. Their answers are in the record, in the memoirs and the testimony and the support group minutes, and the letters to senators that are sitting in archives somewhere, patient and specific and entirely clear about what happened to them and who they would like to hold responsible. They wrote it all down. They said it into microphones when they had them. The institution listened to some of it and continued most of what they were describing. This is the shape of institutional change. It moves, and it moves slowly, and the distance between where it started and where it arrives is real, but is never quite the distance that the people who needed the change required it to travel. The cul-de-sac did not disappear when the Valium era wound down. The ranch house is still there. The station wagon has become an SUV. The medicine cabinet has new contents, different pills, some of them remarkably similar in their promise, if not their chemistry, some genuinely different in their mechanisms and their goals. The structural pressures that made a generation of women reach for the orange bottle, the expectation of seamless domestic performance, the social cost of expressing difficulty, the medical tendency to treat women's unhappiness as a management problem rather than a signal worth investigating. These did not dissolve with the 1970s. They reorganized. They updated their vocabulary. They put on new clothes. They are still, in various forms, available for prescription. The house looks different on the outside now. The avocado kitchen has been renovated. The Harvest Gold carpet is gone, Pergo flooring, or something that looks like stone, something neutral and clean and designed to photograph well for the internet, where the exterior is still being performed, just at a wider and faster and more continuous scale than the cul-de-sac ever required. The social contract of the suburb has expanded to include all the spaces where women present their lives at a curated remove from their actual experience of them, which now includes every screen, every feed, every platform where the clean countertop and the smiling children and the evidence of a managed and functioning life circulates freely. The pressures that produced the Valium generation did not stop producing. They produced the Xanax decade and the Klonopin decade, and the decade in which antidepressants became the most prescribed drugs in America, with a demographic profile not entirely dissimilar from their predecessors. Not identical, the pharmacology is genuinely different, the dependence profiles are different, and some of the prescribing represents genuine, appropriate treatment of genuine conditions. But some of it also represents a medical system that is still, in specific ways, more comfortable with managing women's distress than understanding it, more comfortable with smoothing the symptom than examining the cause, more comfortable writing the prescription than asking the question. The question, for anyone keeping track, is still the same one it was in 1973. What is the distress about, and is the medicine addressing the thing, or just the feeling of the thing? Some doctors are asking it. More are asking it than in 1973. The answer, when it is pursued, still sometimes leads somewhere structural, somewhere that requires not a prescription, but a change in the arrangement, a renegotiation of the life, a recognition that some of what presents as a medical problem is a social problem wearing a medical disguise. The suburb itself has evolved in ways that make the comparison to the 1970s both easier and more complicated. The women on the cul-de-sac today are more likely to have careers, more likely to have legal and financial independence, more likely to have access to therapy without the social stigma that once attached to it. These are genuine improvements. They're also accompanied by a different set of structural pressures. The expectation not only of domestic competence but of professional achievement, parental optimization, physical maintenance, and the continuous performance of wellness, all managed simultaneously and presented without visible strain. The job description has expanded. The audience has grown. The scrutiny has intensified. The pill has a newer name. There is a particular conversation happening in women's health right now about the overprescribing of benzodiazepines to women. Yes, still, and about the way that anxiety disorders are diagnosed and treated in female patients, and about whether the diagnostic frameworks themselves carry the residue of assumptions that have not been adequately interrogated. This conversation sounds, in its broad shape, not entirely unlike the conversation that should have been happening in 1973. It is happening with better tools and better data, and in a different cultural context. It has not concluded. It is not close to concluding. The women who are currently in the middle of it, living inside the prescribing, inside the dependency, inside the fog with the more contemporary name, are navigating the current version of the same structural problem with somewhat better support and somewhat better information, and still, often, insufficient of both. The children on the cul-de-sac today are watching their own parents manage things. Some of those parents manage things well, in ways that are healthy and transparent and involve the full use of their actual feelings as actual information. Some of those parents have their own medicine cabinets with their own contents, and their own particular quality of presence at the dinner table, and their own version of the room with the light off. The inheritance moves forward, not as determinism, but as tendency. The tendency can be interrupted. The interruption requires knowledge, support, and the specific courage of someone who has recognized a groove in the landscape and decided to walk beside it rather than inside it. The house is still on the cul-de-sac. The sprinklers still click on at 6. The kitchen is clean. From the street, everything looks fine. Inside, someone is trying to figure out what fine actually means, and whether there is something in the medicine cabinet that can help her get there, and whether getting there is the same as being there, and whether the orange bottle is the answer or the question. It is probably the question. It was probably always the question. And the suburb, in all its current forms, the physical one and the digital one and the internal one that women carry around in the architecture of their own expectations, is still, in various configurations, the place where that question lives, and where it is sometimes answered with clarity and wisdom and full human presence, and where it is sometimes answered with something that smooths the edges of the asking. The fog had a specific decade. The conditions that produced it are older than that. They are still here, dressed differently, speaking in the updated vocabulary of self-optimization and wellness culture, and the particular modern pressure of being competent at everything simultaneously, with no visible signs of cost. The women inside those conditions are doing what women have always done, which is managing the unmanageable with whatever tools are available, and sometimes the tools are good, and sometimes the tools are the problem, and sometimes it is very difficult to tell which is which until you are already a long way in. This has always been the suburb. It is still the suburb. The lawn is green. The shutters are painted. Something behind the clean window is trying to be heard. The women of the Valium generation did not make a mistake. That is perhaps the most important thing to hold on to by the end of this story. They trusted their doctors. They followed instructions. They tried to be what their world required them to be, and when being what the world required began to cost them something they couldn't name, they accepted the solution offered to them because no one offered anything else. They were not weak. They were not failures. They were the recipients of a medical system's institutional discomfort with female complexity, prescribed quiet when they deserved conversation, prescribed numbness when they deserved to be heard. Their suffering was real. Their resilience, the ones who came through, was extraordinary. And the fog they lived in for a decade or a decade and a half, that fog has a shape now, a name, a historical weight. They deserve to be remembered inside it, not as cautionary tales, but as women who were not given the tools they needed and survived anyway. What we owe them is, first of all, the story. The accurate one, not the simplified version in which a bad drug was given to passive victims by villainous doctors, but the complicated one in which an entire cultural structure conspired, largely through bureaucracy and convention rather than malice, to make the subjugation of an entire generation of women's inner lives look like medicine. That story is harder to tell and harder to hold. It implicates more people, more institutions, more comfortable assumptions. It asks more of us as listeners. It is also the true story, and the women who lived it deserve the truth rather than a narrative shaped for our comfort. What we owe them is also the examination, the willingness to look at the current version of the cul-de-sac, the current medicine cabinets, the current prescribing patterns, the current advertisements in current journals, the the current ways in which the medical system responds to women's distress, and ask with genuine rigour whether what we are doing is different in kind or only in degree. This examination is uncomfortable. It is also necessary. The women of the Valium generation lived through the consequence of a culture that skipped it. We owe them the recognition that they were intelligent women in an unintelligent arrangement, that their suffering had causes external to their own psychology, that the fog was not a personal failing but a structural provision. We owe them the acknowledgement that the lives beneath the fog, the desires, the ambitions, the angers, the loves, the specific and irreplaceable interior lives of specific and irreplaceable human beings were real and worthy and worth the difficulty of excavating. Many of them did excavate. Many of them found, on the other side of the fog and the dependency and the long difficult tapering, a self that had been waiting with remarkable patience for someone to show up and claim it. They showed up. Under circumstances that did not make showing up easy, inside a system that had not prepared them for what showing up would require, they showed up. That deserves to be said plainly and without qualification. We owe them also the discomfort of sitting with what was lost. Not as morbidity, not as a way of deepening a wound that has its own dimensions and needs no assistance in that direction, but as a form of honesty about what the fog cost in real and human terms. The years are not retrievable. The woman who spent a decade in the medicine cabinet, who spent the years her children were young, and her own intelligence was at full strength, and her capacity for change was greatest, who spent those years at a pharmacological remove from her own life, that woman did not get those years back when she got off the drug. She got the self. She did not get the time, and the time was worth something. The time was worth an enormous amount. It was not given back to her, and it was taken not by her choice, but by a system that decided her equanimity was more valuable than her presence, and the accounting of that decision should not be softened by distance or by the passage of the decades since. Some of these women are still alive. They are in their 80s now, or their late 70s, and if you talk to them, if you sat with them and asked genuinely about that period of their lives, they would tell you things that this story can only approximate. They would tell you about the fog in the specific language of their own experience, which is the only language in which it is fully real. They would tell you about what came after, about the tapering and the anger and the marriages that changed or ended and the selves that were found on the other side. They would tell you about their daughters and what they hope their daughters know and what they are afraid their daughters are still carrying. They would tell you about the Thursday coffees and the medicine cabinet and the kitchen window and what it felt like to watch their children from the other side of the glass. They are the primary sources. They are still here. Asking them while there is time to ask is one of the more concrete things we can do with what this story means. What we owe them, finally, is the willingness to carry this forward, not as a cautionary tale about the 1970s, as a contained historical episode safely bracketed in avocado green and harvest gold, but as a living question about what it means to take seriously the interior life of women in whatever year you happen to be reading this. The structural impulse that produced the Valium generation, the impulse to manage rather than hear, to smooth rather than understand, to offer a solution before fully honouring the problem, that impulse is not historical. It is present. It shows up in consulting rooms and in the vocabulary of wellness culture, and in the social contracts of every place where women perform contentment for audiences that are not asking too many questions. The women of the Valium generation were not a cautionary tale. They were a generation of human beings who deserved better than they received and built what they could from what they were given. Their resilience was not inspirational, in the comfortable, distanced way that word usually means. It was specific and costly and entirely their own. They did not survive the fog because they were strong enough for it. They survived the fog because they were human, and humans, with a stubbornness that is sometimes the most important thing about them, tend to survive even the things that are done to them without their full understanding and without their full consent. They survived. Some of them thrived. All of them were here. All of them mattered. That is what we owe them, to remember that, and to let the remembering change something about how we look at the window and what we ask about what is happening behind it, and whether this time, finally, we are willing to hear the answer. And so, here we are, at the end of a long night in the suburbs. You've travelled through the avocado kitchens and the harvest gold carpets. You've sat at the Thursday coffee. You've stood at the kitchen window and watched the children play from the other side of the glass. You've opened the medicine cabinet and understood, maybe for the first time, what was really in it. Not just the pill, but everything the pill represented. The years of being too much for a system designed to contain you. The years of being prescribed quiet when you deserved conversation. The years of managing, smoothing, performing, enduring, all of it done with a competence so complete and so invisible that nobody thought to ask if the person doing it was all right. The women of the Valium generation were all right eventually. Many of them, not all of them. And the ones who were all right in the specific hard-won way of people who found their way back to themselves without a map, through a fog that had no posted exits, in a decade that had no language yet for what was happening to them. They came through. They raised children who asked better questions. They built, in some cases, the second half of lives that were fuller and truer, and more recognisably theirs than the first half had been allowed to be. That is not a small thing. That is, when you look at it clearly, an extraordinary thing. We talk a lot in the modern world about resilience, usually in ways that ask individuals to absorb what should be structural problems without complaint, which is perhaps the one way in which the 1970s and the present moment are more continuous than we would like to admit. But the resilience of these women was not the motivational poster kind. It was the kitchen floor kind, the 3 a.m. kind, the kind that does not look like resilience from the outside because it looks like ordinary Tuesday survival, invisible and unwitnessed and entirely real. History tends to remember the dramatic moments, the marches, the speeches, the public acts of resistance. What it tends to forget is the woman at the kitchen window. The woman who got up every morning and made the lunches and took the pill, and got through the day and did this 10,000 times in a row, not because she had given up on herself, but because she was working with what she had in a world that had not yet decided she deserved more. The history of that woman, quiet, specific, interior, lived almost entirely out of the public record, is as important as any of the louder histories that surrounded it. You have been listening to that history tonight, from your bed or your couch or wherever you are in the dark right now, with the fan going and the lights down and the world on the other side of whatever window is nearest to you. You have been a witness to something that deserved a witness. So before you close your eyes tonight, maybe spare a quiet thought for her, for all of them. The women who got through the fog, and the women who didn't quite make it, and the women who are somewhere in the middle of it still, in whatever form the fog takes now. They were not cautionary tales. They were people. They had things they wanted from their lives, and most of them wanted those things for a very long time before anyone thought to ask. The house is quiet now. The sprinklers have gone off. The children are asleep. The medicine cabinet is closed. And somewhere in a suburb that exists in all the decades at once, a woman is standing at the kitchen window watching something in the backyard, and the glass between her and the thing she is watching is thinning, just slightly, just enough. And she is beginning to understand that it was never the window at all, it was always a door. Sleep well.